could have been a star. Poor Britney. Poor Britney Spears. Hey, let's talk about this EU thing. Before I do that, let me just check in the chat room. Are there people in the chat room? I think Alex looked like a jerk, like a little kid. It was not a great look for Alex. It was not a great look at all. Mm-hmm. Oh. Yeah, he kind of made Marco Rubio kind of look good, which is kind of hard to do. You know, Alex he's drowning. I was talking with Emily last night. She thinks the whole thing is a charade. The whole thing is a put on with him getting taken off the air and everything. Maybe. I might be inclined to agree with that, but he's definitely not looking good. And he's certainly not looking good physically. Not at all. Mm-mm. Okay, let me talk about this other piece here that I wanted to get into today. And it has to do with the EU. It's really interesting because we talk about countries like Germany and France, and Spain, and they don't exist. Those countries don't exist anymore. The men and the women that are theoretically leading those countries, they're nothing more than figureheads and puppets for the EU. People say, well, the EU is really just a trade group, and well, no, that's not the case at all. The EU is a governing body. The EU is become a superstructure. They may as well just take all the names off those countries now and just call it all EU. I mean, it's one of those things where it's kind of like the nationalist or the statist placebo. Oh, yeah. You can be a country. Sure, you're allowed to keep your name. Oh, but just wait. We're going to start shipping people in. And when we do, the culture that you were holding on to, even though you weren't really a country anymore, but you had your culture, well, that's going too. So we're going to culture side you. You're only going to be a country in name. Everything that you have to do, or you have in terms of your sovereignty, is dispossessed and has been handed over to a governing body that you have to answer to. And we will levy you with taxes. We will levy you with any kinds of fees, any kinds of tariffs, and anything that we need from you as a country, you are going to give it to us. Because you voted, your leaders voted to be a part of this union. These countries don't exist anymore. They don't. And their cultures are going by the wayside. And it's all planned. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what's going on here? Why would they do this? Why would they create an element of complete destruction and to some extent even desecration? Why would they do that? Well, if you go back and look at what was happening before 1913. 1913 is a really pivotal year. 1913 is when the United States gets into World War II. Well, I'm sorry, World War I. Prior to that, World War I had already been kicking and was happening. They were about to settle World War I, by the way. They're about to settle it out. Okay, we're done. Let's just draw up the map. No. We've got to bring the United States in. Let's bring them in. Of course, that coincided with the creation of the Federal Reserve, federal income taxes, and the incursion into World War I. It's a game changer. But prior to that, you go back to the 1900s. What we had in Europe were they weren't even nation states. They were principalities, and they were run by families, royal families. the Habsburgs, the Warburgs, the House of Hanover, the houses in Netherlands. These are the people that, the black nobility of Italy, almost all of which are still here and around today, which we'll talk about. So that was a time where they knew, they being the ruling bodies and the aristocrats of Europe, knew that their days as the de facto faces of Europe, as the rulers of the various principalities, their days were coming to an end. And they knew it. They knew it, and in many cases, they were even orchestrating that demise. Look at the French Revolution. The Rothschilds were behind the French Revolution, but do you think they were the only entity behind the French Revolution? No. There were a bunch of other ruling families in Europe that wanted their noble competition in France eliminated. They wanted to eliminate the competition, so they created this revolution. They gave this madman Robespierre a ton of power, and they just started lopping the heads off all the filthy rich, because the French were seduced by these grand ideas of liberté, equalité, freedom, fraternity, noble ideas, but they were being completely hijacked, absolutely hijacked. Sounded really good. It's like, hey, look what happened over there in the United States of America. We could have it here. You know, Lafayette was imprisoned for most of the French Revolution. Lafayette was an interesting guy. He's a Mason, big-time Mason, buddy of Washington. He was urging Washington to free the slaves. So come on, dude. You know, it's like you don't get freedom part way. It's going to be free, be free. So his contribution to that was that he freed the slaves of Guyana. Guyana was under the French Guiana, was indentured, and thanks to Lafayette, that wasn't the case after the American Revolutionary War. So let's go back. They know that their time as being the figureheads of Europe are coming to an end. And they have to. They have to, because they know that things like communication, these people are really smart, been around a long time. And they know that communication is going to be a game changer. And that people are going to use telegraphs, ultimately telephones, they'll come into play very quickly. And they can see the future. They can see that ideas, printing presses, which were kind of large, and there's a lot of labor involved in the printing press, they would become industrialized. They were sitting on the precipice of the Industrial Revolution. And they wanted to control the Industrial Revolution, which they did. And the printing press was akin to today's internet when the Industrial Revolution rolled around. Instead of printing up, say, maybe 100 copies of a book with a manual printing press in a month, you could cook up 5,000 copies of that book in a month. I mean, it's mind-blowing. It's absolutely mind-blowing. So what they did is they began to move away from this ostensible rule of Western Europe. And there were certain families that were going to be taken out. The Habsburgs clearly were one of them. That's when good old Prince Ferdinand was executed, was killed by what's his name, Princip? Gavre Princip? So bizarre. Of course, for some strange reason, it starts World War I. So what they do is they basically have this massive war. They take Germany out, and they slice and dice Germany, and they redistrict all the countries. And they become countries at that point. They're no longer principalities, they are countries. You see the difference here? And they knew that countries were coming and that nationalism and statism would be an important part of this evolutionary process. And it was a very temporary process. Because if you look at this changing of the tide from these principalities to countries, it really is just a blink of an eye before we get into the overthrow of Russia, Soviet Union, 1917. Now we have socialism, communism. And that is the new model. And the socialist model is what becomes part of Western Europe after World War II. And a huge part of Central and part of Western Europe, part of Germany, right, Poland, everything basically from, one side of Berlin east it's all socialistic. And then communistic. And if you look at what happens with the rest of Europe, it becomes very socialist. So the idea that there's this, these national states in Europe is kind of ludicrous in a lot of ways, because that doesn't happen. Again, they're countries by name, and of course they have cultures, but they're just countries by name because now they're being governed and ruled by, for all intents and purposes, a Politburo and a government that is pretty heavy-handed in terms of taxes and fees and all the stuff that it takes to run a socialist country. Really becomes an impediment in a lot of ways for the development of the individual and the development of individual businesses. Like that's what happened with England. I mean, England was so bad, they were so deeply entrenched in their socialist post-war model that that the dole was tremendous. I mean, that was part of a life plan. You would get on the dole. Oh, I'm going to go on the dole for a while. You live in some cheap place, and then maybe if you have any nascent skills as a writer or a rock and roller, you start a band. And you live off the dole. That's what the Clash did. It's what a punk rock band did. So, yes, there have been nation states, but only by some form of label identification. Yes, they had to have different trade agreements and treaties between each country. I used to be in the music business, and I would go to Meedham in the south of France, and you'd have to negotiate rights for every single country. So if you had a record, you'd have to go to every single booth or every single place and go, okay, we'd like to negotiate rights with you. That's a little laborious. So they still had certain rights, trade rights, certain trade rights. But if we look at really who is behind those countries, these were not like full-fledged democracies or republics, right? They weren't. Essentially, these ruling families, the black nobility, the black families of Italy, Venice, they were still running the show. They were still running the show behind this socialist curtain. They were still on top. But this was the most fantastic cover for them. Fantastic cover. To give this pretext of some form of democracy, certainly heavily on the socialist tip. And because of that, becoming very difficult for people to kind of raise themselves up and become economic challengers to their rule, to their domain. So it was kind of a brilliant, they've controlled everything all along the way. Now they created the EU, which had long, I think they were dreaming the EU, in the early 50s? So they create the EU. Now you just go to, the EU, and if you wanted to do a deal for a record, you